Claire Monroe had always believed in building her life with purpose. At 32, she carried herself with a confidence that came from surviving struggles most people never saw. Raised in a modest home on the outskirts of Norfolk, Virginia, she had worked her way through nursing school while juggling 2 part-time jobs. Those who knew her often described her as someone who had light in her eyes, a rare quality in a profession that often wears people down. When Claire earned her position as a nurse practitioner at St. Mary's Medical Center, it wasn't just a milestone in her career. It was a chance to finally prove to herself and her family that every sacrifice had been worth it. She wasn't simply a nurse. She was a voice of reassurance for her patients, someone who remembered their children's names, who explained complex medication routines in plain words, who never let a frightened patient feel invisible. But what made Claire exceptional also made her vulnerable. She cared deeply, sometimes too deeply, and her determination to find something meaningful in every interaction occasionally blurred the lines between professional reserve and personal warmth. It was in these blurred lines, in the sterile white corridors of St. Mary's, that she first crossed paths with Dr. Harold Whitman. Dr. Whitman was 20 years her senior, a calm baritone voice, and a reputation that preceded him. He was the kind of physician everyone seemed to admire. To new staff, he was a mentor. To patients, a savior. To administrators, a fundraising goldmine whose name appeared on brochures and donation walls. When he offered Claire professional guidance, she welcomed it. He praised her diagnostic instincts, often remarking to others how natural she was at reading symptoms other NPs overlooked. That kind of validation from a man of his stature was intoxicating. Claire admired him beyond the professional. They shared late-night shifts, quick meals, and sometimes deeper conversations about ambition, family, and regret. What started as colleagueship shifted into quiet dependency. Claire wasn't naive, but she also wasn't immune to attention from someone so well-established, so charming, so seemingly genuine. Hospital staff began to notice subtle interactions, long glances exchanged in the break room, coffee cups passed with lingering touches. Few said anything outright. Medical circles are rife with speculation, and no one wanted to accuse the revered Dr. Whitman of impropriety. But to Claire, the unspoken understanding between them felt electrifying. She told herself it was just admiration turned friendship, that his compliments, his late-night texts to check on patients, the way he lingered at her station longer than necessary, were harmless. But deep down, she knew. The lines had been crossed. Harold Whitman wasn't just her mentor anymore. He was becoming something far more dangerous. Her secret. What Claire didn't know, what perhaps no one could have known, was how destructive Harold's need to protect his status could become. In those first days of flirtation and secrecy, the affair seemed to promise excitement, affection, and belonging. But later, those very novelties would turn into the noose around her life. Hospitals have long hallways, sterile lights, and the hum of machines that drown out most secrets. But secrets, like infection, have a way of spreading silently until they're impossible to contain. At St. Mary's, where gossip traveled as quickly as lab results, staff began to notice things. It started innocently enough. Dr. Harold Whitman leaning a little too close at the nurse's station to speak to Claire Monroe. To outsiders, it might have looked like mentorly encouragement, but to those who had watched him for years, his demeanor was different. When Whitman spoke to Claire, the sharp efficiency he normally carried as a renowned cardiologist softened. His smile lingered longer, his voice dropped a tone, almost conspiratorial. One evening, a respiratory therapist walking past the ICU break room paused. She noticed the doctor and nurse practitioner huddled over coffee, laughing quietly as though the rest of the hospital didn't exist. That laughter was warm, alive, out of place in corridors where grief usually lingered. Was it wrong? Maybe not. But unusual? Absolutely. For months, these small observations multiplied. Whitman bringing Claire her specific brand of coffee when no one else received such thoughtful luxuries. Claire working late long past when her shift had ended, just as conveniently as Whitman found reasons to check in on charts. Both of them leaving through the staff parking lot, often within minutes of each other. It could all be coincidence, one charge nurse murmured to a colleague. But the problem with coincidences is that when they repeat too often, they begin to look like patterns. Meanwhile, outside the controlled order of the hospital, Whitman's family dynamic was fraying. His wife, Julia, had noticed his distance. He was home later, distracted at the dinner table, his phone seemingly always buzzing with hospital updates. Julia had played this role her entire adult life, the physician's wife. She was used to Harold's long hours, the unpredictable calls, the stress of life or death decisions. But this was different. His excuses carried a cold detachment now. His eyes avoided hers when she asked too many questions. One night, when he left his phone on the counter by mistake, Julia glanced at a notification. A short message preview from Claire lit up the screen. Made it home safe. Miss you already. Julia's heart dropped. Back within the hospital walls, whispers became murmurs. A radiology tech told a nurse she saw them laughing together in the parking garage. A medical resident remarked on how the doctor seemed different with Claire compared to other staff. Administrators didn't comment. Dr. Whitman was too valuable to the hospital, a man whose reputation drew both patients and donors. But tension had a way of thickening the air. People didn't need confirmation. They just knew. And so did Julia. Behind closed doors, the dynamic between Whitman and Claire shifted from sweet secrecy to pressure. Claire, tired of hiding, confronted him in a hushed voice one evening after a long shift. "I can't keep doing this forever," she whispered, frustration undercutting her exhaustion. "I don't want to be just someone you text in the dark. I want something real. Otherwise, what's the point?" Her words hit him harder than she realized. For Claire, this was a plea for honesty. For Whitman, it was a threat he couldn't afford. Hospitals may hide sins within their blank walls, but every whisper was another fracture forming in the polished image of Dr. Harold Whitman. Friends who knew them both sensed change. Claire's smile seemed forced. Harold's focus wavered. What happens when a man with everything to lose collides with a woman who refuses to remain in the shadows? The affair was no longer the thrill of stolen moments. It was a secret struggling to stay buried in a place where even the smallest murmur could explode into scandal. And Whitman was beginning to realize that if Claire refused to stay silent, he would have everything to fear. The affair, once a thrilling secret, was beginning to suffocate Dr. Harold Whitman. For months, he and Claire Monroe had managed to disguise their closeness as mentorship, their stolen phone calls as late-night professional consultations. But the tighter he tried to secure the illusion of normalcy, the faster it unraveled. Harold Whitman had built his entire career on precision and control. He was the physician who never flinched, never raised his voice, never let personal bias cloud a judgment call. Colleagues trusted him because he was consistent. Donors respected him because his name symbolized success and stability. If the truth about Claire became public, all of it, his board seats, the upcoming research grant, the flawless career that made him a symbol in the Richmond medical community, would collapse overnight. Worse, he pictured the headlines: respected cardiologist exposed in workplace affair. The carefully constructed life he had built would not just crumble, it would disintegrate. At home, Julia grew less subtle. One evening, she stopped him in the hallway as he packed his briefcase for another emergency consult. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes burned. "Harold, how many times do you expect me to believe the same excuse? You're not fooling me." "Who is she?" He froze. The practiced calm of a seasoned physician faltered. He muttered something about needing to stabilize a patient, brushing past her. But Julia's suspicions had hardened into near certainty. Later that night, Whitman lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing she might soon confront him with evidence. Claire's texts, a credit card charge, a colleague's comment. He couldn't control Julia's digging, and the thought filled him with dread. If Julia's suspicions whispered in his ear, Claire's demands screamed. She loved Harold, but she was tired of the shadows. "I've given you everything," she told him bitterly one night in the parking lot. Her words sharp enough to cut through the humid Virginia air. "My time, my future, and what do I get? Lies and hiding. Tell me, Harold, what exactly am I to you? Because I won't keep being your dirty secret." For Harold, her words twisted into threat. She wasn't only talking about their relationship. She was talking about exposure. Her ultimatum, leave Julia or risk losing her, sounded to him like, leave Julia or I'll tell her myself. It was an interpretation that lit terror in his chest. At the hospital, his dry humor diminished. His smile turned mechanical. Nurses noticed he now second-guessed routine chart orders. Residents whispered that he seemed easily irritated, distracted during grand rounds. Small mistakes, hardly noticeable before, now became glaring to his perfectionist nature. Claire too sensed the shift. The once attentive Harold was now tense, cold, often more silent than affectionate during their secret meetings. When she touched him, his body felt stiff. Less desire, more calculation. Every part of Harold's life pulled at him in opposite directions. His wife circling closer to the truth. His lover demanding commitment and threatening exposure. His career, standing like a fragile glass tower, ready to shatter under the weight of scandal. In his mind, pressure built like an artery constricting, a patient moments away from collapse. And worse, it wasn't just his secret life at stake. If Claire spoke out, it wouldn't only be ruin, it could be prison. He knew the hospital had strict anti-fraternization policies, and if the board discovered his misconduct, there might be complaints, lawsuits, investigations. He told himself he would not let his life collapse because of one mistake. No one can say exactly when Harold's thoughts shifted from desperation to planning. But friends would later testify that sometime in early 2019, his whole demeanor changed. His conversations grew sharper, his patience shorter. One administrator recalled him saying, "Some people don't realize how much harm they can cause when they don't think before speaking," though she assumed he was referring to a medical intern. But in Harold's mind, there was only one person capable of destroying everything he valued. And her name was Claire Monroe. The man who had spent a lifetime preserving hearts was now dangerously close to losing his own, in rage, in fear, in obsession. The bond that had once been intoxicating would soon transform into a trap, and Harold Whitman, the respected doctor, was preparing to do the unthinkable on the surface. It looked like another chilly Friday night in early March 2019. Richmond's air carried the sharpness of late winter. The lake country, an hour outside the city, lay quiet and still. But for Claire Monroe, this night felt like a turning point. Dr. Harold Whitman had told her he finally had a plan. After weeks of arguments, secrecy, and ultimatums, Claire agreed to meet him at his secluded lakeside cabin. This was the refuge Harold had used for years, occasionally with Julia, more often alone under the guise of needing quiet to review research. For Claire, it was supposed to be the place where she would finally hear that Harold was ready to step out of the shadows. Claire's friends later said she seemed torn that day. Her colleague Jenna recalled her hesitance. "She told me Harold was ready to make decisions. She wanted to believe him, but I could tell she was nervous. Like part of her was afraid she was going to get hurt. Not physically, no one imagined that, but emotionally." Still, Claire made the drive. Her phone records showed texts to Harold on the way. "Here. At least this time don't back out." The last message she ever sent. The cabin's lights glowed against the still water of the lake. Inside, Harold waited. To anyone else, he seemed calm and composed that evening. He had wrapped himself in the same professional composure he wore in the operating room. Decisive, unshaken. But beneath the facade, his thoughts raced, each one feeding the paranoia that had consumed him for weeks. He couldn't let her expose him. He couldn't lose everything. Tonight would determine whether his life survived intact, or ended in ruin. When Claire stepped across the threshold, the smell of cedar and lake water filled her lungs. He kissed her cheek, perfunctory, almost cold. She noticed his stiffness immediately. At first, Claire spoke with her usual softness. She wanted reassurance. She wanted Harold to tell her he was leaving Julia. "I can't do this anymore," she said, pacing near the window overlooking the lake. "If you're not going to be honest, then at least be honest with me. Tell me I've been wasting my time. Or tell me you choose me." Whitman's eyes followed her steadily, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't plead, didn't deflect. Instead, his words came slow, icy. "You don't know what you're talking about, Claire. You have no idea what I've put at risk for you. You don't get to threaten me." Her heart stung at the word threaten. She was demanding love, not destruction. But the conversation spiraled quickly, her voice raising, his sharp replies landing like scalpel cuts. What happened next would never be fully reconstructed. Prosecutors later said it was in that rising storm of accusations and fear that Harold Whitman snapped. Neighbors across the lake recalled hearing nothing out of the ordinary that night. But in the cabin, things turned violent. Autopsy reports would reveal bruises on Claire's arms, consistent with being grabbed forcefully. Defensive scratches on Harold's wrist showed she tried to fight him off. Whether he struck her first, or whether she threatened to walk out and expose everything, no one could say. But as evidence would show, Harold overpowered her. And in the end, the woman he once claimed to love lay silent, her body submerged in the water just yards from where they had argued. Whitman worked quickly, relying on a surgeon's discipline. He disposed of her phone, wiping away messages before hurling it into the lake. He staged the scene to suggest Claire might have accidentally fallen. When he returned home hours later, Julia stirred in their bed as he slid beneath the covers. He whispered only one word when she asked if he was all right. "Tired." But secrets leave traces. Forensics would later reconstruct what Harold tried to erase. The deleted text messages, the bruises, the suspicious timeline. For now, in the stillness of that lakeside cabin, Harold Whitman told himself he had solved the problem. Claire Monroe would never speak again. What he hadn't accounted for were the questions that silence would leave behind. On the morning of March 4, 2019, Claire Monroe failed to report for her scheduled shift at St. Mary's Medical Center. For most staff, it would have been a mild inconvenience, perhaps grounds for reprimand. But for Claire, it was unheard of. She was the kind of practitioner who often arrived early, checking charts before her colleagues came in, ensuring her patients were prepped. Her absence sent an immediate ripple of concern. By noon, her colleagues at the cardiac unit were exchanging worried texts. "Have you heard from Claire?" One nurse messaged another. "No, it's not like her. She would have called." When her phone went straight to voicemail, concern escalated. A supervisor contacted her listed emergency contact, her younger brother, Daniel. He hadn't heard from her either. By evening, her family reported her officially missing. Police in Henrico County opened a file that, at first, they treated as a welfare check. Detectives quickly noted Harold Whitman's name in connection to Claire. Several co-workers volunteered that the two appeared unusually close, and some even speculated about a romantic connection. When approached, Whitman held himself with his usual composure. "Yes, I know Claire well," he told detectives. "She's one of the best nurse practitioners I've worked with. She mentioned she needed time, the stress of the job, you know. We had plans to talk, but she never showed." His words were meticulous, rehearsed. To officers trained in reading tone and body language, something about his calm felt unnatural, too perfect. On March 6th, 2 days after she vanished, Claire's car was found parked near a secluded access road by Lake Cheston, the very lake where Whitman's private cabin overlooked the water. The vehicle was locked. Her purse remained inside. There was no sign of Claire. The police requested voluntary cooperation from Whitman. He insisted he last expected Claire to meet him but claimed she'd never arrived. He played the role of the worried mentor, shaking his head sadly. But detectives noticed the faint red scratches by his wrist, still visible despite his explanation of a work accident. Meanwhile, Claire's family held vigils and posted flyers. Her mother's pleas on local news stations struck a chord. Claire would never walk away from her life. She wouldn't do this to us. Something is terribly wrong. The community began buzzing with speculation. Some remembered seeing Claire's car by the lake. Others whispered about trouble at the hospital. Rumors of something more between her and Dr. Whitman. The missing person case was steadily turning into a criminal investigation. Phone records deepened suspicion. Claire's last known call had been with Harold. Text messages revealed her insistence on meeting to finally get answers. Even more troubling, Multiple texts from her to Harold had been erased from his phone within hours of her disappearance. Digital forensics later recovered them from backups, the words haunting. "I won't keep hiding. I deserve better." Investigators felt the story unfolding in front of them. Claire hadn't simply vanished. Someone wanted her silence. 4 days, search and rescue teams combed the lake and nearby woods. Volunteers handed out flyers. Claire's face appeared on nightly news, but Harold Whitman kept to his routines. He went to the hospital, saw patients, performed rounds with his customary restraint, though staff noticed a new distance in his eyes, as though his thoughts were always drifting elsewhere. What he didn't anticipate was how quickly the body in the lake would turn speculation into certainty. On the morning of March 9, 2019, 5 days after Claire Monroe was last seen, the surface of Lake Cheston was eerily calm. The wind carried the cold bite of late winter, the kind that kept fishermen onshore and joggers on their treadmills. Only a local boater, scanning the water near the reeds, noticed something unusual floating in the shallows. At first, he thought it was debris swept in from the storm the night before. But as the boat drifted closer, the shape became unmistakable. The pale outline of a woman's body, hair fanned out in the water like a dark halo. Police arrived within the hour. The missing person case became a homicide. Divers pulled Claire Monroe's body from the lake. Bloated but identifiable, she still wore the silver bracelet her brother had given her. The coroner confirmed drowning, but bruises showed she had been restrained. DNA under her nails matched Dr. Harold Whitman. She had fought for her life. When detectives told Whitman, he muttered, "I was afraid of that." His story kept changing. First she never came, then she stormed off, then she ran to the water. But evidence told otherwise. At Claire's vigil, her family vowed justice. The public turned on Whitman. The respected doctor's reputation collapsed. He was arrested on March 15, 2019, charged with second-degree murder. At trial, prosecutors showed bruises, DNA, and deleted texts. They said Whitman killed to protect his image. The defense argued it was a tragic accident. But the jury saw through him. On November 18, 2019, Whitman was found guilty. Weeks later, he was sentenced to 34 years in prison. His wife divorced him. His hospital erased his name. Claire's brother stood outside court, holding her photo. Claire deserved life. Today, at least, she got justice. The doctor who once healed hearts was now a prisoner, undone by pride, lies, and murder.